hopefully get by the end of this session is a better understanding of the work associated with whole systems approaches, Kerry, and to physical activity. So, and also a better understanding of challenges that this presents for evaluation and learning, and then ideally a good understanding of the evaluation and learning approach, what we're doing as a substance and as that consortium to support the evaluation and learning, but then also what your role might be as part of that learning network. And so for some of this might be brand new, for some of this might be a refresher, but really it is an opportunity to just ask questions and interrogate things a little bit more. So I'll pass on to the next section. And what I wanted to do was actually really go a bit back to sort of the purpose and just ask the question, what are we actually all doing here? What do we mean by a whole systems approach to physical activity? And how does that look across Greater Manchester and within each of the localities? And I think most of you will have been involved, or some of you, not Greater Sport, but some of you will have been involved in the round robin of summaries that we've been providing to the localities over the last couple of months. And that's just really brought home to me that not only are you all doing different things, but actually in some circumstances, your interpretation as a group differs from one another in terms of what you mean by a whole systems approach or what you're actually focusing on. So I just thought it might be worth explaining to start off with the breadth of what that means to you as a collective, because I hope you'll appreciate that if what you're doing is different, or if the focus of what you're doing is different, or your intentions are different, that adds another layer of complexity for evaluation and learning, and for our ability to share ideas and to transfer ideas across the piece. I can see you're stamping and your face is also telling a picture, so don't worry about it. So let's move on to just do this basically a thought experiment in terms of what do we even mean by a whole systems approach to physical activity. So first I'm going to move on to just remind ourselves of what we're doing here. So what we perceive, and I hope everybody does agree with this, is that physical activity or increased levels of population physical activity is in itself a good thing, particularly if we happen to like being physically active or doing sports or exercise or just moving in our everyday life. But perhaps even more importantly, we know, and the evidence is extremely strong, that it has a positive benefit for health, for social and for economic outcomes. So there's both physical activity as an end in itself and as a means to an end. But what we also know, in terms of the academic evidence that's out there, is that physical activity is not just an individual choice. So we might think about the idea that people can just get up in the morning and say, well, I'm going to walk to work today, or I'm going to I'm going to go by bike to pick up my shopping, or I'm going to participate in sports. But what we know is that just an individual effort towards physical activity isn't sufficient. And in particular, parts of society are much more constrained in terms of their choices and their abilities to just be active. So what we've seen in academic evidence is that we've tried to raise people's capability and opportunities and motivations to be active. But if that's just focused on an individual alone, without thinking about the structures and the systems and the environments around them, it's not sufficient to make the changes that we need for the population health outcomes that we want. So I hope that people are sort of appreciative of that. This is one of the reasons why we're taking a whole systems approach in the first place. So I'm going to build outwards from this slide and just say, well, what's the next layer out? What would be the next area by which you could try to influence to make a system or make a culture that's more conducive to physical activity? So if you move out one step, think about the people around us. So that might be your communities in your geographic location, but also your communities in terms of who you might work with, your families. And largely what we think about there is about whether or not it's usual to be active. So are the social norms and cultural norms conducive to people feeling like physical activity or moving or being able to do things in my community is something that people like me do? And if we're taking that as an approach to support physical activity, then that might lead us towards things that are called, with various different names, asset-based community responses. And that's where we talk about involving local people or co-production, or thinking about what are the assets, maybe the physical assets. They might be like the local parks or the blue spaces, or the social assets, the networks, the champions who might be supporting local people to be active. So if we move one step further out, we might think of, now I'm starting to use this word and I know that nobody knows what it means, so I have to explain myself, but we think about the institutions, the environment and the priority in policy, how we actually use resources and the extent to which we promote physical activity across the policy landscape. And that might mean embedding physical activity into policies that aren't necessarily traditionally expected to be physical activities. That might be education policy or housing policy, transport policy, and I know a lot of you are doing that kind of work. And so we might call this technocratic efforts to make it easier to be active, that you can't really escape being active because everybody's telling you to be active from all different directions. But if you think about that, the direction of command or control is coming from the sort of the statutory organisations, those that sort of have decision-making capability at the moment. And if we move out one further step, we know, and I think you do know this across the system, but some recent reanalysis of active lives that Tim has coordinated through Substance has just completely reinforced the fact that our physical activity levels are intrinsically linked to structural inequalities. So by that we mean disadvantage that people experience because of variation in education, in their access to work, their health, ethnicity and other protected characteristics. And so if we're trying to consider that as somewhere we need to influence, rather than even necessarily think about physical activity itself, we might think about how do we strengthen place-based approaches to tackle inequalities. And you may be aware, some of you may have read the Marmot report that came out today, which is specifically focused on Greater Manchester and really illustrates and highlights the social inequities that have had an impact on COVID, and has also had an impact on things like lifestyle behaviours such as being physically active. So I'm just going to pause for a moment there, first of all, for any questions on just this variety of potential strategies. I guess what I'm saying is that what we've seen is that not everybody is doing all of this, and I can imagine that you might find it relatively overwhelming to think about doing all of this, but actually your focus is in different places as well. Does anybody have any questions on this before I just move on to the next little comment? No? Okay, I'll move on, and then I'm going to get ready for stamping in a minute, everybody. So the next thing to consider is that these are all, we're thinking about strategies and ways in which you might approach the problem and ways in which you might conceptualise a whole systems approach. But there's also something else to think about, which is that these things aren't in and of themselves in isolated, neat little sections, that actually there are interactions and intersections and dynamics between and across them. So, you know, people don't just sit in a community, they also work in a different space, and they might have an influence on policy, and the way in which we work together is highly complex. But one of the things that we're going to come on to later, and one of the ways in which we're making sense of it as an evaluation group, is actually to look at those patterns of behaviour and how they might cross and transcend these different strategies. So that might, I don't know if that is clear to people, but when we talk about enablers of change, they sit sort of behind this layer in those ways of working. We're going to come on to it later, so I don't need to go into it in too much detail now. But I just wanted to say that even that complex picture is a little bit more complex because of the underlying ways in which we work and operate together. Right, so we'll move on now to think about the actually, given this breadth and given this complexity of what you're doing and all the different things in turn. Thanks, Lucy. Yeah, any further reflections, do just put them into the chat. You know, I apologise, I've not got a chance to speak to everyone. Is that what challenges does this pose for us in terms of evaluation? So again, this is me telling you what challenges we have as evaluation partners, but also do consider this in terms of how you might explain those challenges to people that are expecting you to evaluate or to provide evaluation findings a bit similar to what they're used to with regards to metrics and monitoring and the like. So what are the challenges for evaluation? Okay, so first of all, a whole systems approach to physical activity, understatement of the year, there's enormous complexity. It's also not a discrete intervention. So you might have worked on projects before where you're just bolting on a bit of a service, or you're looking at a project in a place and it starts and then it stops and it's quite well defined. This isn't like that. Obviously, you're trying to intervene in different ways in different places, and it's completely enmeshed within the context. And because the idea is this is a pilot, but it's trying to embed new ways of working, it's trying to have influence and legacy, there's not really a defined starting point or ending point. Again, which gives us problems as evaluators to say, well, you know, to say what's changed and what's the time frame for change. You know, certainly what's been promoted by you as a group, but also by Sport England, is the idea that this work needs to be a test and learn. And I've added some more academic language here in terms of, we might say that it's emergent or it's iterative. So really what we mean by that is that things develop that you wouldn't necessarily expect based on what's being put into the system. It's not just a sum of the parts, it could be more than that or less than that, and it's very hard to predict. But you do see change, you do see shifts in the system, and it's useful to know how and why those things have occurred, ideally, so you can try to do more of them. And then the other really important point is that there are multiple perspectives and different sources of knowledge. So we might think that there are sort of patterns that are interesting and important to look at, but we need to look at them from different angles. We need to, you know, to think, and Tom, you've said this to me before, you know, from whose perspective are we defining a system even? And those are all of these challenges that we have for evaluation, which means that, and again, some of you may already know this, but I'm just providing you this so that you can respond to others, that typical modes of evaluation, so for example, controlled studies, so you might have heard them as randomized controlled trials, they assume that we can actually define the intervention and we know what aspects to control. So that's an idea where you have a test where you put something into one place but you don't put it into another place. That only really works to show a difference if you actually know what are the key bits of this that's changing the system versus this. We don't know that in whole systems approaches. Comparison sites, another way we'd normally evaluate, are impractical and also impossible due to the complexity, and in Greater Manchester, due to the absolute size of the region. Because they don't account for the shifting conditions that might be underlining things. So a pre and a post test assumes that everything else stays static over the course of time. And I mean, we all know from the last 15 months that the background to the work that you're doing hasn't remained static. You've been working under huge context shifts with regards COVID. And before that, other big context shifts such as universal credit, austerity, you know, those things play a big part in the effectiveness or others of interventions that pre and post tests aren't sensitive enough to pick up. If we use KPIs, that assumes that we know what good looks like. So how do we know that 20, you know, having 20 people through a social prescribing intervention is good? These are somewhat arbitrary numbers, and they have sometimes the impact of focusing people's attention on the numbers rather than the quality of the work that you're doing or what you might be learning along the way. And the final point is that the monitoring outcomes and holding providers accountable to those outcomes assumes that those partners have control over them. But as we've just described in the last map, there's so many complex contextual features that affect the outcome that it's not really fair to say that the provider is responsible for that outcome. In fact, it's more important to think about how the system as a whole provides the outcome and how the intervention or the project that you might be running has an influence in contributing to that outcome. So this is just really saying why it's a difficult thing to evaluate using the same or the normal traditional methods that we've used in the past. Does anybody have any questions on that before I move on to the next slide? No?
That makes more sense.
Oh, Wahid, come on, you need to tell me if you can't see my slides. I forgot I needed to do that again. Okay, I've said all this, so I'll just move on. But there is a slide there for you after the session to refer to. Okay, right, next one. Okay, so what does this mean in terms of an evaluation? So we're moving from evaluation for accountability, which is probably the paradigm in which you're used to working, to evaluation for learning. And in actual fact, the relationship between evaluation and learning is very enmeshed and interwoven. So I've come up with a new idea called the evaluation and learning weave, which we're going to work through together right now. That your context is unique, and even if that's at a hyperlocal level or a local level or even a regional level. And so it's, you know, paramount to understand what the context is and those different aspects of context that might be affecting how you're working or how you can make change within a system. It might be using also new evaluation tools and methods, or just promoting some of the old ones in different ways. So things like reflections and reflecting on your experience being really paramount and important in this area. as well as developing new tools. So things like when we talk about system features or the maturity models or perceptions of system maturity, these are new tools which I'll come on to in a minute. So that feeds into, ideally high quality data are captured, but across multiple sources and lines of inquiry. So it's not just that we are looking at one project in isolation, we're looking at lots of different projects all at the same time, or lots of different ways of working all at the same time, and lots of different lines of inquiry. So what do we do about that? How do we actually learn from that when it's just like lots and lots of information and it seems quite disconnected to each other? They're just, data from here, there and everywhere. The approach that we take is to use that data to bring it together to create nuanced explanations of how and why things appear to be working. So when they're working in certain circumstances and when they're not in others. And we do that by a process of abstraction. So Stephen in the breakout group that I was just in was talking about asset-based community development or working with communities and saying, getting to the heart of the issue around people with disabilities and helping communities to understand that that's 1 in 5 of them and that it's really a pertinent issue for them and it's something that could matter to them. The idea of asking somebody what matters to you, that's transferable, isn't it, across contexts. You could, if you're trying to affect change in for people of different ethnicities, you can ask the same question, what matters to you, and the same principle, underlying principle applies. And I know Russ has mentioned it from Stockport, that he can ask that question of his system stakeholders or policy stakeholders, to understand what their organisational objectives are. So when we talk about these transferable ideas, we're talking about generally those underlying dynamics. If you think about that first map that I showed you, patterns of ways of working that help to unlock some of these aspects of the system that can be transferred across contexts. And then the second aspect of that is that I know there's a desire from the groups here is these practical outputs. What can I actually do? If somebody's done some work with housing, what can I learn about that? Or how can I learn how to put physical activity into my employability scheme? And it's something that we as an evaluation team can make sense of, but it's also important that we connect you together, or that you work together, or that you find those opportunities to work together. And I know that Steve and Emma and Kate and a number of you are working on that particular theme together. The next sort of part of this weave is that collective sense making, and that goes back to the point I was making before about multiple perspectives, that you can see something, you can see data, and you can see an example of a case study, for example, that might have worked. But your interpretation of that will be slightly different to someone else's interpretation. And actually spending time together to try to explain it from different points of view or to offer a different explanation helps us collectively to learn more about how change can happen at a more granular level. And that could actually transform into, to an extent, a learning network where people are sort of consciously trying to work through problems together. And then the last part that I wanted to highlight is that learning is great. And obviously I work in a university and it sort of really is my kind of bread and butter, but there is simply the need to then be able to take that learning and to apply it into a context and to actually try to act on the basis of the learning that you have developed. And so this is where we thought, think about it not in terms of great big projects necessarily, but in experimentation, in iterating your approach, and over time, you become more, you get greater understanding of how this works or what might make a change, and you can do more of what you hope will have that effect and less of what we know is holding some of these system features back. Really, again, just think about what is therefore the basis for learning. And this is to Russ's point, to Richard's point as well. But if you look at the left-hand side of this slide, first of all, we can think about how do we as individuals learn? What's our strategies and the basis by which we learn? So one is actively reflecting on what's happened. And I know we've said this before, but one of the things that is quite crucial in this work is to take that active reflection stance and to see it as part of the work and to create and carve out time for it. And I find that difficult, and I'm a researcher, that's my job to do that. So I know it's not an easy thing to do, but I think it's collectively and in your individual time to just carve out time to reflect. And Kath's going to share in the next workshop, Kath will share some tools that might help you to do that. The other sort of individual basis for learning is around just experience. So, you know, you don't know sometimes unless you try, unless you give it a go. And so this is sort of where you actually, it relates back to the point I was making around that iterative and those mini tests and learns to have a go at something and then see what you learn as a result. And obviously there is still a wealth of insight and evidence out there, or that you could use to inform your learning and get better understanding of what's going on. And these can all lead to evidence-informed practice. But it's not a problem, it's obviously brilliant to have individual learning, but what we don't then manage to have is something which can transfer across context. If it's just something that you kind of hold in your own head, then it's not something that the system can use or can benefit from. So that's why I've got this blue arrow going to the other side, is that what we're looking for, what we're trying to do is to identify a cumulative level learning. So that's where we all put our learning together and we collectively make sense of things. And this is when we're looking for those patterns, and we're looking for patterns that might help us to understand how systems change might come about. And you will know, though, you'll be familiar with those in terms of the enablers for change. Those might describe patterns of working. So, you know, if we think that involving local people can support us to have more equitable ideas around the table, if we think that working across organisational boundaries or across and within sector working helps us to break down some of those system sort of silo working and governance issues. So what we are looking for is these patterns that transcend specific contexts, and we can understand more about how we can make changes there. Those can be transferred across settings. So to Russ's question, or Russ's point earlier, if we know more about how we can work together to you know, break down silos across sectors, for example, if we can develop the theory and evidence, so it might be new commissioning models, or it might be new procurement models, or it might be new ways of sharing risk across sector partners. If we know that, then we can transfer it to lots of different questions that might not just be about physical activity, but might be about other things. So that's one of the things that the Substance Consortium are really aiming to do, is help to bring together all of your individual learning and support that, but actually make sense of it as a whole so that we can transfer that across contexts. Any questions on that one? I appreciate that we might be needing cups of tea at this moment. Okay. Sort of building on the, so as you know, Tim and I and the rest of the group have worked with Greater Sport to re-secure the contract for evaluation and learning, which we're obviously thrilled to work with you on. And what we've suggested, and Tim presented in the local forum yesterday, is that we recognise that everybody's on a different learning journey and they're at different stages, but we also wanted to present a vision of where we might get to collectively in the future, which is around, you know, really thinking about having a thriving evaluation and learning network. So, you know, right from the start, Richard and the team at Greater Sport have looked at different ways to support that cross-learning and having the forums, those that we used to go to in person, and now different formats that have been in place. And that's a continual work in progress in terms of what's the best way to sort of get people together and to share. Is it on a regular basis? Is it on topics? Is it on ways of working? you know, and we're always open to ideas in terms of how you think that should evolve. But what we're ideally hoping for is that the learning is embodied in practice. So that's exactly the point you mentioned, Richard, earlier, that it's not just a talking shop and that we think about how difficult everything is, but it's actually orientated towards supporting you to make better decisions, knowing that it's always going to be uncertain, there's always some risk involved, but that you can make better and better decisions, that we are working together to create the tools and to collect the data that can help us to make sense of what is what's working and what's not working, and why it's working and when it's working. That there's more connectivity, and that people like yourselves, like other local leaders, feel confident about the evaluation and learning space. And again, that's incumbent on us to help build your capacity and your comfort levels with that and your confidence in that. That we work to identify where there are opportunities to understand what you feel confident about, what you might need more support with. And then this is one that I've really seen. You speak back to us and say that you might understand this evaluation and learning approach, but the systems and the governance structures in which you sit outside of this room, I think that's what you were saying, Hayley, earlier, don't understand this approach, but you don't feel the confidence to be able to make this case and explain why it's different in those spaces. So, you know, maybe we want to get to a point where that governance structure is structured around learning, does appreciate these different approaches, does appreciate how they might need to change their systems to accommodate or embrace complexity, like we're trying to encourage, and that those evaluation and learning systems are valued. So that might be, you know, one version of a vision, and it's something that perhaps we can just pause for a moment to again, to just think about whether or not that is a vision that you share, and that people may have you know, different levels of comfort with that as an idea. So Emily, if we could just go into breakout rooms, I just want to, you won't be able to see this in the breakout room actually, will you? So just have a look at one of those hexagons perhaps, and think when you go into the breakout room, you know, whether you share that vision of the future, and what sort of opportunities or challenges you see in us actually reaching that vision of the future. To briefly revisit this map that we had at the beginning, to just think about if these are our strategies for whole systems approaches to physical activity, then what does that mean in terms of the focus for the evaluation? Right, what might we be interested in learning about? And this isn't an exhaustive list by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm just putting them here in terms of ideas and thoughts to stimulate sort of your ideas. So I've already mentioned about the enablers of change, and whilst they, in terms of topics, relate to some of the these other strategies, so for example, involving local people and building assets, you might naturally associate that with asset-based community responses. You know, my view is that actually these enablers of change go across all of those possible whole systems approaches of physical activity, and so I want to actually almost dissociate them as, you know, you only involve local people if you're doing asset-based community approaches. Actually, how can you involve them so they have an influence in decision making that goes beyond just their local communities? Potentially transforming governance and process isn't just about how to work in sectors. It's actually potentially how might you work differently to release funds to those communities. So it's that, you know, we see them as transcending across those different strategies, and those are things that we also feel are helpful at being able to transfer ideas from context to context. What I'm hearing from Chris is that they then need contextualization and putting into plain English so that they are really usable in those new contexts, and I think that's a really valid and important point. But in terms of the evaluation across these other elements, what might we be interested in? And I want to stress that these data points on their own don't tell us very much. and nor do we privilege one form of data over another. But it's about how can we use these different data points to make sense of the whole, and the parts of the whole. So if we're thinking about strengthening place-based approaches to tackle inequalities, we might be interested in monitoring over time, because that's a long-term ambition, isn't it? We're not going to change that in 6 months or a year. Those longer-term outcomes that are captured in various different formats in these kind of longitudinal surveys and other indicators. We might be thinking about, you know, practically speaking, you would need to be working across organisational boundaries to be able to support, you know, changes, fundamental changes in opportunities, and in order to get a sense of who, you know, what matters to real people on the ground, potentially using some participatory systems mapping. And these are all techniques that we're going to build into a kind of repository that the local pilots can use, you know, according to your needs. So I'm just really, all at the moment, I'm just seeding the ideas of what you might be interested in doing, you know, as part of this evaluation and learning endeavour. So from a technocratic point of view, you know, what we might be interested in seeing is okay, you've got the people from different sectors around the table, they're coming to your steering group, but is there actually changes in policy? Are those changes in policy supported with implementation or operationalizing strategies as well, which makes them come good? I don't know if you were noticed in the September report, but we had done a policy analysis for Greater Manchester and saw that physical activity was actually present in most of the overarching policies across Greater Manchester. But what was lacking is that implementation. So, okay, yeah, it's there in the lines, but what do you actually do about it? So we'd be interested in knowing how to convert those policy recommendations into action. In terms of the evaluation focus around the asset-based community development, you know, to really focus on those community-led initiatives where they may be happening, and also assessments of, you know, whether people feel they have access to assets. And I've put here commons, but this is maybe not a word that everyone's familiar with, but effectively, do they have social capital? And again, I draw your attention back to the Marmot report today, saying that in the most deprived communities in Greater Manchester, just as it is across the country, they also have less social assets or common assets, and that really corresponds to physical activity, because we know that access to green space and to places to be active is much less in some of those deprived areas. And then in terms of the change, you know, the individual changes, I mean, this is where it is always helpful to have case studies and narratives and to hear directly from people on the ground. But, you know, as we've mentioned in previous meetings, this isn't something that Substance can just do alone. And so I just wanted to collectively now, rather than do it in our breakout groups, is to think about what can you as individuals in the system do that is related to evaluation and learning. So what is an option for you to do as part of this endeavour? So again, I'm not going to present this slide, but it will be in the slide that comes around to you. And I just wanted to highlight to people that as we grow and as we get bigger, and as we want to embed the evaluation and learning in everyday practice, there is an extent to which you know, our roles will be more merged with your roles as well. And so what we want to highlight is that Substance will continue to do work on the evaluation design and undertake interviews and do training sessions and support the capture of when you're seeing shifts in the system. And we use our accounts and measures document, don't we, to try to capture those shifts in the system, and we want to continue to capture those shifts in the system. We might change the way we do that, but those are still really important things that Substance will lead on, as well as the perception survey and analysis of active lives. But there are things that the central team, the localities, you know, we need as we get bigger. We need for everybody to be taking an active role in this. And so those are things like capturing reflections or thinking about how you might bring in those community voices, and participating as you do in those sense-making sessions. So it's not to kind of go into detail on that at the moment, but it's just to really encourage everybody to think about what their active role is in that, and to ask where you need support for building confidence, and or the tools that you might use to do some of that evaluation practice or learning practice or translation practice. And those are conversations that we'll continue to have with you in the next few months. So just to highlight some of the tools that we are thinking about working with and developing and using, just to get a sense of what you'd be interested in. So on the left-hand side, we've got the substance-led activities. So those are the interviews, counts and measures, the perception survey, deep dives around particular topics that might be happening across 3 or more of the localities, the secondary data analysis of active lives, and those collective sense-making sessions. And what we would offer going forward in terms of support and advice might be around some of the following. So helping you to work through theory of change or programme assumptions, and that's part of the, potentially could be part of that design-led approach as well. How you might go about doing participatory mapping, what reflective tools you might have, advice and support for additional qualitative or quantitative measures to be able to measure some of the activities that you are involved in. By activities, I mean broadly activities, not just putting on Zumba classes. And then, and then obviously there's always the option to commission a small piece of evaluation to go alongside the work as well.